So welcome back to Trauma Lens Care. This is a second video of a series. The first video you can find at traumalenscare.org. We will be doing a series of videos trying to help explain brain development in children and how stress can alter and change the brain and what we see in our kids when this happens. This video is called Brain Development and Stress. And so we're excited that you came to join us today. My name is Stacy Gagnon, and I am the founder and the director of Trauma Lens Care, and I'm joined by my husband, Darren.
Yeah, Stacy and I spent a lot of time, many years as foster parents, and we learned a lot of really hard lessons. Fostering is a really challenging thing, as anybody who's fostered knows. So what we wanted to do was with these videos to try to share what we have learned over the last few years and allow other foster families and people who work with these kids to not have to learn the hard lessons that we learned. So I wish we knew back then what we know now. And so what we want to do is we want to talk about how the brain develops and how stress and trauma in the life of kids, especially in foster kids, how that changes the way that the brain works and then leads to really challenging behaviors, because all of us know that work with these kids, the behaviors are really hard. And so what we're just trying to do is provide some understanding to where the behaviors come from, and then hopefully give some tools for parents to be able to change the way they handle those behaviors.
So we've said this before, when we first started parenting and we first started fostering, we really thought that we were going to be able to foster and care for these children just like we had done our biological children. And so it was kind of a big shock or a slap in the face, I guess, when a lot of the techniques and the things that we had done in the past did not work. And so rewards and consequences, things like setting out chores and there being, oh, if you do this, then you'll receive this. All of these things tended to blow up in our face. And we also saw children that would have responses to things that seemed completely over the top. And so we started researching and figuring out what we were dealing with and how we could parent a little differently. One of the first indicators, or one of the first kids or children that came into our home that we really saw or highlight what we saw in kids with trauma was, we will call them Jack and Jill. It was a sibling group that came to our home when we were first fostering. And so with Jack and Jill, we started parenting like we had our biological children. Jack was 4, almost 5, and Jill was almost 2 years old. And so the best way to describe them, Jack was incredibly hyperactive. He could not sit still to save his life. He was into everything. He got into our pantry in the middle of the night and would eat and eat and eat. He was not potty trained at this time. He had accidents all the time. He was aggressive. He was loud. He was out of control. And so I wanted to step into this as a parent, and I wanted to control him. Jill was the exact opposite. Incredibly compliant. Docile would be a perfect word. She sat at my feet quiet all day, which is not what a 2-year-old should be, almost 2-year-old should look like. She never cried. She never made demands. And so here we have two completely polar opposite children. And here I am as a parent thinking, wow, she is doing well, and he is absolutely over the top. And so I think for me, the first moment where I recognized what I was doing was completely wrong was what we call the cupcake story. I had made a bunch of cupcakes to share with the kids after dinner one evening. And so I brought in all the kids, you know, my biological children, and then our foster kiddos, Jack and Jill. And I just said, hey guys, I made these cupcakes. We are not going to eat these until after dinner, so I don't want anyone to get into these. And I left them on the counter. And I'm sure all of us can kind of be laughing because you know where this is heading. I left the room to go do laundry. And when I stepped back into the room after being gone about 10 minutes, Jack was standing there with cupcake all over his face and double fisting 2 more chocolate cupcakes. Well, I rounded the corner and I saw this, and immediately I was upset because I had told them they were not to touch these. And so, as a very non-seasoned foster parent, I asked him, did you just eat those cupcakes? And all of us can know exactly what his response to me was. No, I did not eat the cupcakes. Well, in that moment, that triggered some anger in me. And so I was going to make him tell me the truth, because that's what I would have done with my biological child. And so I said, you are holding the cupcakes. What do you mean you didn't eat the cupcakes? You're holding them. And his face was completely blank. And he looked at me and said, I did not eat the cupcakes. I don't have the cupcakes. Now, mind you, here's a child holding 2 cupcakes with cupcake all over his face. And in that moment, he's lying to me and adamant that he did not eat those cupcakes. And that to me highlights and shows that he was not willfully lying. His brain had done something or gone somewhere that was telling him that if he told the truth in that moment, he might actually die. And so what I want Darren to do is explain to you what his brain did. And if you remember last video, we talked about red brain, green brain. Jack has a red brain, and Jill also had a red brain. And in that moment, Jack's red brain overrode all of his conscious thought, so he was going to react out of a subconscious level.
Yeah, when we talk about the brain, it's really important to understand that so much of the behaviors that we see, we tend to focus on the behaviors without understanding where the behaviors come from. So this conversation sort of is going to go to the way the brain works so that we can understand why the behaviors happen. And so in the video we talked about last time, the red brain, green brain video, we talked about how the brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the back to the front. So what that means is that the thinking parts of the brain, the cerebral cortex, the top part of our brain, is the last to develop. And so when you have a child who has experienced a ton of trauma and really, really awful things, they get stuck living in the basement of their brain. So then when we understand the basement, what happens in the basement of the brain, this is where the amygdala is, and it's kind of the seat of the brain that functions to control our life support systems, and it's all automatic stuff. And so for Jack, in that moment, when he had that response, when he got caught in doing a behavior he knew he wasn't supposed to do, his brain, the thinking part of his brain goes offline, which if it was online at all even to start with, his thinking brain goes offline. He drops down into the basement of his brain and he reacts from the stress and he automatically lies, even though he knows, like his brain would know if he was thinking clearly that he's going to get caught in this lie. But the way the brain works and the way the brain systems operate, his cumulative trauma over years and years, basically he was not able to take the basement of his brain and calm it down to the part, to be able to use the part of his brain that would allow him to think. And so when we talk about toxic stress, that's a pretty common term these days. And toxic stress is when cortisol levels is produced in the brain and floods through the body, and it causes a lot of issues with the body, right? So causes our heart rate to go up, causes our eyes to dilate, gets us ready for some physical activity in light of stress, right? It's that fight or flight response. But the problem is, when that is a daily thing and you live in that stress day after day after day and it never is alleviated, it is always there, that cortisol is just constantly being flooded through your brain and your body, it changes the way your brain works. And so these poor kids, Jack and Jill, had grown up in an awful situation and had experienced the worst trauma, I think, that maybe we ever saw in foster kids. And so we should have known better at the time. But his brain was not operating with cognition. He was running so much on subconscious, not conscious thought, but subconsciously. And so for him, food was an issue. He really struggled to be able to control himself in light of now having a pantry that he could raid, having cupcakes he could have access to because he had grown up without a lot of food. And so that was one thing we should have known at the time. We learned that lesson the hard way, that we needed to meet that need in him to keep that from happening, because we set him up to fail by creating an environment that he couldn't be successful in.
So one of the things that we like to utilize when explaining what was happening with Jack, but even also what was happening with Jill at the time, was when we think about the brain, and Darren had referenced this, it's a bottom-up, back-to-front development. So the bottom part of the brain, so like let's pretend this is the brain. The bottom part of the brain, that is actually starting to be developed in utero to about 18 months to 2 years. All right, so this bottom part is being built, resilience is being built through the attachment cycle or serve and return that we talked about in video 1. But when you move to the middle part of the brain, that's the emotional part of the brain, and we see that developing around 2 to 5. And we know that the 2 to 5-year-old, they live in emotions, right? We laugh and we say that our 4-year-old, she gets pissed when her soup is wet, okay? So we know that's the emotional seat. Then we move up into what are the thinking parts of the brain, all right? And that's after the age of 5. And the thinking parts of the brain are things like executive functioning, cause and effect, language, upper math skills. All of those things are not developing until past the age of 5. Well, when I rounded the corner on Jack, what his brain did was, as an almost 5-year-old, was this, all right? His brain flipped. He flipped his lid. And so he's leading with emotion, right? And this is not accessed or be online, right? So as a parent, my brain did the same thing as his, right? So I went out of my thinking brain and I was going to lead with emotion. And so we have 2 small brains who are going to start fighting. And we laugh and we say it's like 2 T-Rexes fighting. So 2 small brains who are fighting are never going to get anywhere. I first needed to calm myself in order to handle him. And so what we like to utilize when we're talking about this is something that was referenced to me when I was working in the jail that is used in AA, and it's called HALT. And HALT are 4 basic needs that must be met in order for your brain to be here. HALT. H is for hungry. Okay? So he was hungry. He lived in a constant state of feeling hungry because he had been deprived of food since early on. Him and his sister, we found out later, had been left in a room all alone, and there were people in the apartment building that did not even know children lived there. Okay, so hungry. I needed to provide access to food for him that was healthy anytime he needed it, to know that need was met at all times for him. Oftentimes with foster kids, we ended up giving them a box of their own food that they could eat at 2 in the morning if they wanted. Afraid. He was afraid. Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big, scary adult. I came at him in an aggressive way. And remember, whether or not my tone of voice was big, my body was big at that moment and very scary. He didn't know me. L is lonely. Lonely. He just lost his parents. And whether or not his parents were dysfunctional or had been abusive doesn't matter. He had lost his main caregivers. T is for tired. Okay? And so is this child getting enough sleep? And so when you see your kid do this, and you see big behaviors, you need to remember HALT. Hungry, alone, afraid, lonely, tired. Those are the 4 things. Because if I can bring those back online for him, and I'm back online for me, then we're going to be able to bring a calming influence into him and affect the brain. And 2 things to remember with our kids. There are only 2 ways to change the brain, and that's relationship and environment. Now, a new foster child to my home, I don't have relationship with. He doesn't know me. This child, Jack, had been in my home for 2 weeks when this occurred. I have no relationship with him. I needed to utilize environment. And looking back in hindsight, I know that changing the environment would have been, number 1, not leaving cupcakes out on a counter that he can have access to, right? If I don't want them eaten, then I shouldn't have left them out for him to have access to. Number 2, environment is, okay, if he has a food issue, I'm going to provide that box of food of healthy snacks that he's allowed to access at any time.
Yeah, I think back to that day. I remember Stacy was pretty upset, and it was not a good few moments, but it was definitely a learning lesson for us. And I think to the relationship part, we use the term relational capacity. With our biologic children, we could say, don't eat the cupcakes, we're going to have them later. And they knew that they could trust us, that they could believe what we said, and that they were going to get to enjoy them later, and that was not something we were going to miss out on. And they had their needs met, and so they were able to regulate themselves. And when we talk about regulating, it's regulating in light of stress and being able to manage your own stress response. And so for our foster kids, obviously not in that situation. We had no relational capacity with them. They could not trust that they were going to get to eat later on, and they're hungry now. And cortisol, that drug makes us hungry. And so we stress eat, right? So a lot of us, even when we come home from work or whatever, we're stressed and we stress eat. It's because that's one way to alleviate the feeling from the cortisol. And so for him, we just messed that whole thing up from the get-go. And so we learned you can't treat your foster kids the same way that you treat your biologic kids, your neurotypical kids who have relational capacity, who have a regulatory system and all of that. These kids were living in complete fear. And so that just changed. And that's not even their fault, right? Obviously, they were a product of their environment and their brains were changed. And so they reacted and they did all these things subconsciously. And so it took us a long time. It probably was 8 months of real intense working with those kids before we really started to see them turn the corner. And in the end, they really did well. After about a year, when they left our home, they were doing much, much better. They had started to regulate themselves, and we learned a lot of hard lessons, but real valuable lessons through that.
And I want to end this video and just say, probably the most valuable lesson in that moment is that I was the one that went into this small brain with a kid that had trauma. And so you have to regulate yourself and be calm and think about halt even for yourself as an adult, because you cannot co-regulate or help a child who has trauma if you yourself are not calm. And in that moment, I should have never responded how I did, because his stress reaction, and this is for any child that has trauma, stress behaviors are not conscious. He did not consciously do this. He subconsciously did this. And that's going to be the biggest thing that we learn in these videos, is how we as the adult are the ones that are going to lead the way in these children being co-regulated. It starts with us. And so our next video, we're going to be talking about windows of tolerance, and we're going to be referencing Jack and Jill, how they both responded to trauma in a different way. Remember, Jack was hyper vigilant and Jill was hypo-vigilant. Thank you so much for joining us today on Trauma Lens Care. We hope you will join us for our next video when we will be talking about window of tolerance.